Part 5, Section 2, Chapter 23 of Short History of the Christian Church by John Fletcher Hurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23, The Antislavery Reform. The history of slavery in America is contemporary with the history of the country. In 1619, a Dutch frigate stopped at Jamestown, Virginia, and sold 14 negroes to the colonists. English merchants carried on the trade assiduously. The Royal African Company, chartered by Elizabeth, agreed to furnish in 33 years 144,000 negroes, many of them to the American colonies. The colonists, as a rule, had few, if any, scruples on the subject. The Virginian settlers of North Carolina carried their slaves with them. South Carolina was settled by planters from Barbados, whence slaves were brought by one of its earliest governors, Sir John Yeamans. The only colony in which slavery was outlawed was Georgia, and this, according to Bancroft, was not due to the humane sentiments of Oglethorpe, but to public interest and safety. In 1743 the anti-slavery laws were repealed. The cultivation of cotton, rice, and sugar in the South naturally attracted slave labor to that region; and although, on account of climate and other considerations of convenience, the Northern States employed less and less of slave labor, the merchants of Boston, Salem, Newport, New York, and other Northern cities carried on the slave traffic with great enterprise and zeal. In many cases the outborne cargo was rum, which was exchanged in Africa for negroes, who were brought to the Southern States and became a part of the inheritance which only a great war destroyed. 300,000 slaves were imported into the colonies previous to 1776. Early voices were not wanting against slavery. Its inconsistency with the Declaration of Independence was the occasion of taunts without number. As might be expected, the New England states developed the earliest anti-slavery sentiment. As early as 1703, a verdict of damages in favor of a slave for the recovery of wages and freedom for the years after the age of 21 was rendered by a Connecticut court. In 1766, a similar verdict was given by the Superior Court of Salem, Massachusetts. In 1780, the Bill of Rights, declaring that "all men are born equally free and independent," was adopted by Massachusetts. It accompanied the Constitution of 1780, and was drawn up by John Adams. On the strength of this bill, the Supreme Judicial Court declared that slavery was abolished in Massachusetts. A similar decision did the same thing for New Hampshire, and so strong was the sentiment in Vermont that the first article of its Bill of Rights in 1777, before it became a state, branded slavery as an institution unworthy of the support of mankind. The Colonial Congress in 1774 made a similar declaration: "We will neither import nor purchase any slave imported, nor will we hold intercourse with those provinces that do not agree with the same." This healthful feeling pervaded the whole Revolutionary period. "The spirit of the master," says Jefferson, in his Notes on Virginia, "is abating, that of the slave is rising from the dust, the way, I hope, preparing for total emancipation." The Revolutionary Fathers were sound on this question, and far in advance of their times. Washington, in his will, provided for the emancipation of his slaves. He said to Jefferson that it was "among his first wishes to see some plan adopted in which slavery in this country might be abolished by law." Franklin became the president of an abolition society in Philadelphia in 1787. John Adams echoed the words of Washington. "Every measure of prudence," he said, "ought to be assumed for the eventual total extirpation of slavery from the United States." In 1787, When the Constitution of the United States was framed, slavery would have been abolished by that instrument had it not been for the opposition of South Carolina and Georgia, the inhabitants of which states believed slave labor a financial advantage. They firmly refused to go into the Union at all unless slavery was left untouched. The Friends seem to have been the earliest body to take action against slavery. In 1688, the Germantown, Philadelphia Quakers petitioned the yearly meeting to do something for the overthrow of the institution. From 1696 to 1776, the Society nearly every year declared the importing, purchase, or sale of slaves by its members to be a disownable offense. John Woolman and Anthony Benezet are illustrious names in the history of this reform, 1746 to 67. Benjamin Lay, also a Quaker, reprinted the tract of Judge Samuel Sewall, of Massachusetts, The Selling of Joseph, which was first published in 1700. In 1770, Dr. Samuel Hopkins, a Congregationalist divine, pastor of the First Church, Newport, Rhode Island, began to preach against the slave system. Owing to the energy of its shippers, Newport was the principal slave mart for all the 13 colonies. Hopkins entered into the controversy with intense earnestness, and his sermons, pamphlets, and newspaper articles exerted a wide influence. He also devised a plan for African colonization and evangelization. Wesley's testimony against slavery was not without effect in America. In 1784, at the organization of the Methodist Episcopal Church, the following were the official records of the Church. "We view it (slavery) as contrary to the golden law of God, on which hang all the law and the prophets, and the inalienable rights of mankind, as well as every principle of the Revolution, to hold in the deepest abasement, in a more abject slavery than is perhaps to be found in any part of the world except America, so many souls that are all capable of the image of God." Explicit measures were then mentioned for the emancipation of every slave held by any members of the Church. This declaration closed thus: "What shall be done with those who buy or sell slaves, or give them away? Answer: They are immediately to be expelled, unless they buy them on purpose to free them." The subsequent history of Methodism, however, marked a continuous retreat from this position, until in 1836 the General Conference passed a vote of censure on 2 of its members for attending an anti-slavery meeting in Cincinnati. Nevertheless, in 1796, a protest had been made against the "crying evil of African slavery," and somewhat similar measures of manumission urged upon the Church as those outlined in 1784, but this time only in the case of official members. Slave selling, however, was prohibited. In 1800, preachers were particularly designated as the objects of discipline and disgrace in case of holding property in human beings. In 1804, the descent had gone so far that the discipline, besides paring away the resolutions of 1796, made the following notable concession: "The members of our societies in the states of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee shall be exempted from the operation of the above rules." The Presbyterian Church began its testimony with the same boldness. In 1787, the synods of New York and Philadelphia earnestly recommended abolition of slavery. This judgment was reaffirmed by the General Assemblies of 1793 and 1794. In a note to the 142nd question of the Larger Catechism, slavery was denounced as man-stealing. Slave holding, however, was not made a disciplinary offense, and the note on man-stealing was erased in 1816. The Presbyterian Church contented herself with general statements on the evils of slavery, and with urging an ultimate emancipation. A period of quiescence followed. Slavery had become thoroughly entrenched in all the Southern states. Any effort at exscinding the slaveholding element would have caused a rupture immediately. The Protestant Episcopal and the Roman Catholic churches did not discriminate against the system. Even the Quakers grew cold. Slave owners were freely admitted into the Presbyterian and Methodist churches. The disruption of Methodism, in 1844, was due not to a return to Wesley's high ground of slavery as a sin against God and an outrage on human rights, but to the fact, as asserted in the resolution of the General Conference, that Bishop Andrew's involuntary connection with slavery "would embarrass the exercise of his office as an itinerant general superintendent." His suspension did not call a halt to the exercise of that spirit of concession which had been a marked feature in all the utterances of the Methodist Episcopal Church. This spirit had gone so far that, in 1836, the General Conference charged the ministers and members of the Church "to abstain from all abolition movements and associations, and to refrain from patronizing any of their publications." Though the official representatives of Christ were very cautious and conservative, hoping and waiting for a time when Providence would interfere to remove the evil, the gospel had nurtured many a man whose life was devoted to the overthrow of the great curse. Chief of these was William Lloyd Garrison, who at an early period said, "Emancipation must be the work of Christianity and the Church. They must achieve the elevation of the blacks, and place them on the equality of the Gospels." He was a printer and journalist, and from the time of his association with Benjamin Lundy, an eminent Quaker philanthropist, in the publication of the paper, the "Genius of Universal Emancipation," in 1829, to the final overthrow of slavery, he labored with quenchless devotion to his work. Sometimes mobbed, he pursued his course with an enthusiasm that nothing could daunt. His plans were peaceable. He depended entirely on the force of truth, public sentiment, an enlightened conscience, and moral energy. In accordance with his principles, the New England Antislavery Society was formed in January, 1832. Garrison had a host of helpers. It is impossible to do more than mention the names of some of those prophets of the better time, who led for so long what seemed a forlorn hope. Stephen S. Foster, Nathaniel Peabody Rogers, Parker Pillsbury, James G. Birney, Elizur Wright, Jr., Isaac T. Hopper, Gerrit Smith, Joshua Levitt, Arthur and Lewis Tappan, Oliver Johnson — these and many others gave the cause the advocacy of their voice, their pen, their life. The times demanded men of heroic mold. Harriet Martineau calls it the "martyr age in America." The mobbing of public speakers was nothing uncommon. The eloquent George Thompson was compelled to flee to England in disguise. Garrison was dragged through the streets of Boston with a rope around his body. Lovejoy was murdered in Alton, Illinois, in 1837. Birney's printing press was destroyed in 1836. It was the martyrdom of Lovejoy that gave Wendell Phillips to the cause. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 brought out Theodore Parker. The eloquence of Henry Ward Beecher was enlisted. Noble women like Lydia Maria Child, Lucretia Mott, Abby Kelly, and Mrs. Stowe gave their influence also. That most powerful novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852, was really, as Nassau W. Senior, the English economist, said, a pamphlet against the Fugitive Slave Law. Whittier was the poet of the movement, helped by other master singers — Bryant, Longfellow, and especially Lowell. But it was reserved by an inscrutable providence that not by the Church, nor by philanthropists, nor by law, should American slavery receive its death blow, but by the bloody ordeal of a 4 years' conflict between the North and the South. Abraham Lincoln signed the death warrant of American, if not universal, slavery by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation on July 1st, 1863, a warrant executed by the greatest civil war in all history. The South is acquiescing in this result as a providential deliverance. Her people have learned that slavery was, after all, only a most expensive system, and had they the option today to choose its restoration, they would promptly refuse the offer. The Southern people have entered upon a new era of material development and religious prosperity. The American Church is girding itself to the solution of the questions presented by the unparalleled spectacle of a race of magnificent possibilities suddenly elevated from the condition of chattels to that of free citizenship. No church in any country has ever been burdened with so great and sudden a responsibility. The future will prove that no church has discharged its delicate and difficult task with more heroic spirit than that of the whole American Church. End of chapter 23.